how much he dislikes it. So that's why he's under my name. Anyway, one of the things that I want to put out to you is Kaffe is a reaction junkie. If you sit there as if you've taken a vow of silence, he's going to think you're not interested, you're bored, he's boring, blah, blah, blah. Oohs and ahs go a long way. Okay? So don't sit there behaving yourself. If you like something, show a little bit of appreciation, okay? But we're nice and informal, we're all of the same mind. If you have a question, holler it out. His favourite part of the lecture is at the very end when he does question and answer time. So you can either hold off to there, or if you want more information on the slide that's up there, just say, what's that about Kaffe? And he might give you a mouthful of cheek back, or he might give you a little bit more detail about it, okay? Now, pronunciation on this guy's name. We've heard a lot of interpretations. You can imagine, when I joined the studio, or I joined working with Kaffe about 26 years ago. Can't believe I'm that old, but anyway. And when we first went to Scandinavia, I kept on seeing all these signs saying, welcome, Kaffe. And then I started seeing signs saying, welcome, hot Kaffe. I'm like, wait a minute. And then it was welcome, hot Kaffe and cream. I'm like, this is wrong. There's me, naive me, thinking that our PR had done a really good job getting the word out. Well, K-A-F-F-E in Scandinavia is coffee. Anyway, you grow up very quickly. His first book, as a lot of you will be familiar, when he first came out, was Glorious Knitting. And in America, they always change the titles, and they call the book Glorious Knits. Now, a lot of people have admitted that they went around here. A lot of people admitted that they'd gone around not believing that guy had done this knit book, and so they were looking for a book written by Glorious Knits. Yeah. And then in the UK, we hear over the radio, and I get this, a woman phoned up a well-to-do bookshop, and she said, do you have Glorious Knitting by Yasser Arafat? If he did learn how to knit, he might not have. Anyway, I won't go there. But anyway, bless his cotton socks. But so the easiest way to remember the pronunciation on this guy's name is somebody candid, but she was a rep, and she used to go around to her customers and say, "Listen, you have a safe asset with Kaffe Fassett." It's not bad. Safe Kaffe. So when you go up to, at the end, when you go up and say hello, he'll be doing a book signing or whatever. And so if you want to say his name, think Safe Kaffe, and there you go. That's how you can remember, and you can correct your friends if they say it wrong. So let's just have a little bit of a warm-up. We're going to have a safe asset with who? Kaffe Fassett. Oh, come on, I'm in Cape Town. We have a safe asset with who? Kaffe Fassett. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to His Lordship.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I just thought I'd start out by saying that I was raised in California, in a very, very rough part of California. There was no electricity. There was just one little two-laned highway. And my parents just had the incredible tenacity and courage to build an extraordinary restaurant, a modern restaurant called Nepenthe in Big Sur. So here we were in Bobcat country with this amazing state-of-the-art modern restaurant designed by a Frank Lloyd Wright student. And because it was so bizarre and surreal, it attracted people from all over the world. And we got written up in Life magazine. Nobody even knows what that is anymore, but that was a big deal. I mean, forget hello. This was huge. So I grew up hearing stories of the old world, and even though I was a product of the new world, I never really felt I belonged there. I was not short back and sides and clean underwear and everything that goes with that, you know, that kind of American upbringing. I longed for the old world, and when I would hear people telling stories of the Orient and Scandinavia and the south of France and all these incredible places, and Africa and India. I longed to go to these places and to be part of a culture that had some history. So when I first got to England, I remember a woman, I said, I'm working at the American Museum doing a little guidebook to their things. And she said, American Museum? Do they have any history? And I thought, well, we have a bit. And then I said, I wasn't going to come to England because, you know, I felt that England was kind of too much the same. You know, we all speak the same language. And she said, that's the theory. So I realized, okay, well, we speak a weird colonial language that isn't understood in England. But anyway, I came to England because somebody decided that I was kind of interesting as a person, but I needed finishing, and they were absolutely right. I was very raw. And I was very much wanting to be an artist. I had gone to, I got a scholarship to go to an art school, and it was a 4-year course. And I thought, I'm not a brain surgeon. I lasted 6 months, and I went off on my own to teach myself, because they brought out the color wheel. Now, I knew that was the work of the devil. So they couldn't see me for dust. I was out of there. I hope it's not worshipped in this venerable place. But anyway, I found myself, you know, going to Europe and loving it. And going to England was just like walking into warm water. I just felt completely at home. You know, you'd go to great country houses that were very important, and the drapes would be hanging in shreds. The carpets would be worn out so much that you couldn't even see what the pattern started out being. The wallpaper was stained with rainwater, and people loved it that way. I mean, this was bizarre. You know, if anything gets slightly soiled in America, it gets replaced. You know, we have new all the time, so it's a very, very fresh place. And it's extraordinary to have been in this place that was so relaxed about the patina of life and enjoy it. So I loved all that. And I loved the gardens, and I loved the architecture and all of that. So I was very, very happy. And one of the things that was a big revelation to me, because when I grew up in California, a lot of people knitted. And the selection of yarn was, you know, brown and black and white and red and shrieking colors. And, you know, the idea of subtlety just didn't come into it. And so it was amazing to go up to Scotland with a friend of mine who was an incredible designer and see the most beautiful landscape I'd ever seen in my life before. Beautiful, soft, rolling hills of heather and lichen and wonderful peat-stained rivers. And there was a goldenness and a kind of otherworldliness about this beautiful landscape and this beautiful set of colors. And in the mill where this friend of mine was buying hand-woven fabrics were these incredible yarns that were all the colors of that landscape. And I thought, I can't ever remember seeing such subtle and beautiful colors being used. You know, I mean, it was twin sets and pearls and navy blue and beige all around. And I thought, what is wrong with people? So I sat down and bought myself 20 colors, jumped on the train back to London, and got somebody to teach, it's a sort of famous story now, got somebody to teach me how to knit on the train back, because I was going to have a sweater knitted, and I was furious at this girl that was going to take forever to knit this sweater while I was having ideas 10 times a minute. I hadn't met her yet, but I was furious at her, you know. Anyway, I got to the point where I learned to knit, and I just sat and did nothing for ages. I had a painting career. I was painting white still lifes. I was not interested in color at all. But little by little, color was coming into my paintings because I was so turned on by the Victoria and Albert Museum and other decorative art museums that were, and wonderful houses, you know, going and visiting these great estates where they would have beautiful oriental pots and Indian paintings and things on the wall. And I would be looking at these pattern on pattern and thinking how wonderful that was and the rich colors. And so a little bit of that was creeping into my paintings. And I was getting, putting a pattern cloth and then putting pattern china on top of that and maybe some flowers in a vase or something. So it was all little patterns and colors that were coming into my work. And that's what it's always been about for me. When I learned to knit, I put 20 colors in my first sweater, and that was totally what I was into. If it wasn't colorful, I couldn't do it. I once knitted a beige sweater, and I thought I was going to go out of my mind. Because you never know where you would knit for a millennium, and you would have an inch of beige. And there was no sense, like with pattern, you get to the top of the diamond and then you start the circle or whatever, or the flowers. There's a sense of progression and a sense of achievement. Oh my God. Anyway, and I watch people sitting these days, they can't stop knitting these beige sweaters and on it goes. And so anyway, it gets...
Have you been to New Zealand?
Yes, I have. I know that. In New Zealand, they say, oh, we love color. We knit with Jacob's fleece. And that's the end of it. And I don't know if you know what Jacob's fleece is, but it's just a spotted sheep. It's brown and white. Fabulous. Push the boat out. Anyway, so when I first started knitting, I said, my motto is, when in doubt, 20 more colors. And for God's sakes, don't worry about how many colors you have across a row, because with knitting, you can just keep adding wonderful, manageable lengths. And I've had shawls that had 80 colors in a row, and no problem at all. But people don't believe it. They have to sit down and actually make it before they realize how simple the whole operation is. But it's been a wonderful trip, and I've really, really enjoyed designing and working. And of course, one of the things that was so interesting to me about knitting was that I saw the whole world as knitting patterns. I would go somewhere and I see some amazing Elizabethan architecture and color on the walls, and I would see it as a knitting pattern always. It bored the hell out of everybody I traveled with. Somebody said to me once, "It never stops, does it?" I said, "No, But what was so interesting is that one of the great worlds, because the thing about knitting is that geometry is very exciting for a knitter. I mean, flowers and faces and things like that are much more difficult to achieve. But it's with geometry, you can just kind of memorize a pattern and you can just let go, and that becomes the vehicle for color. And that's one of the things I really learned. It's a way of organizing units of color and making it exciting. Because I would look at balls of yarn and think how wonderful they looked, and then I would knit up a Fair Isle sweater, and it just dissipated the color. It was little bits of pattern, and what happened to that wonderful orange next to that lime green? It now looks like spinach in your teeth or something. It just didn't work. So anyway, I got to the point where I was looking for units all the time, and one of the great worlds of geometry, of course, is patchwork quilts. So I was looking at tumbling blocks and great squares of color and chunks of fabric that people had cut out and put together. And so that world was very, very interesting to me. And also I found really good patchwork quilts, scrappy ones with lots of atmosphere, were much more interesting than my paintings, I felt. I could look at them forever, just all these unexpected little patterns and where did they come from. So when one day Liza Lucy of You've Got a Safe Asset fame got in touch with me, and she said, I've just had a child and I've learned to do patchwork because I've made a patchwork quilt for my child. And I said, "Oh, that sounds lovely, darling, And she said, I think you should get into this." And I said, "Really? Isn't that just cutting up old clothes and sewing them back together?" And she said, "Oh, you are so naive." She said, "It is much more complicated than that." So I said, "Okay." let's have a go. And she started to lure me into it. She started sewing blocks out of my knitting patterns. She would take a knitting pattern of mine and reduce it to patchwork. She was putting it back into patchwork, actually, so we've gone full circle. And I started correcting her blocks. She would send them to me in the post, and I said, this is all right, but there's too much white. That was usually the comment, or it's too dark, or whatever. And I would start, correcting. And so she said, you're designing, here we go. So anyway, we sat down and did a book together. And it was the most exciting thing I'd ever gotten into, because one of the things about knitting, particularly when I was teaching knitting, it was like watching paint dry, People they knit backwards, They have fewer stitches an hour later than they had. Oh my God, it drives me nuts. Anyway, so I'm a very fast worker, and I have no patience at all. So I get on with things. And so one of the things about patchwork is, you have a roller blade and you cut fabric and you stick it on a wall, and boom, before lunch, you've got a quilt up on that wall. It's very, very immediate and exciting. So I found that where I just took to it absolutely beautifully. And I was using a lot of furnishing fabrics because I wanted big flowers. I wanted scale. And I noticed that a lot of the patchwork world was in Little Thimbleberry land. I don't know if you know, but that was a little company that did little patterns that were sort of the size of ants' testicles, It was completely maddening, these little rows of circles and things, and it just drove me nuts. So I was definitely up for nice, big English roses and peonies and leaves and ferns, and, let's get some scale and some largesse here, some grandeur. And so it was very exciting when I was able to actually sit down and begin to design my own fabrics, because I could put that scale in. And the memory of those wonderful English chintzes that I had come across in drapes and tablecloths and wonderful couches and things when I first came to England. So all of that went into my work. And I always paint by hand because I can think better that way. I did actually do colorways for Philip Jacobs for a while on a computer. And I would sit down with a computer person and we would try to work this out. It was so laborious and so difficult to get it right. Whereas painting is just very, very immediate and exciting and visceral. I can feel my way and feel when colors are right, the sort of temperature of the colors and so forth. So I'm a hands-on guy. I'm a complete Luddite. I used to be able to say, at least I can answer a telephone, because I certainly don't own one, but the idea that I can't even answer them anymore, you pick this thing up and you're talking away and somebody else is saying hello, 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 because you haven't pressed the right button or done a program to say hello to the world. So it just drives me nuts. So I'm terrible this way. I mean, I know that it's what you all live for. The rest of the world is on these little black boxes walking down the streets and crashing into things. And when I look at the tube and every single person on the tube is, consulting their black box, it just amazes me. I'd rather knit myself. So, anyway, I do appreciate, and the fact that Brandon, thank God, knows all about these, is not at all frightened of them. And so the outside world does get a look into our studio, and we get a look out. So that all works. Now, as Brandon says, please do shout out any questions as we go along, because we're going to plunge in. If we can get all the lights down and get the slides going. This is my white period. I did hundreds of white on white still lifes like this. So much so that I even had a cauliflower, because I figured that's white, in one of my still lifes, and the little green leaves were just too poisonously thrilling. I had to get them out. So I had eggs and things like that, and had many shows, and that was where I was going to stay for the rest of my life. But until I got so intrigued with these Oriental patterns, little by little, color began to come into my work through ribbons and flowers and very delicate china, and shells was the first sort of peep of color. Now, when I first came to England, I had to come to terms with gray. It was quite amazing to realize that everybody dressed in gray, you know, the gray pinstripe suits and everything. I knew that their underwear must be fascinating underneath that, but I didn't get there. So it took a while, but I began to be so intrigued by the shades of gray and the silveriness in gardens and things. So I started using a lot of gray in my knitting. And this is one commission that I had. This is silk and mohair and cotton and everything else you can possibly imagine, wool, because I didn't realize you weren't supposed to mix those things up. I didn't know any of the rules. I was just going, and I would just cast on the back panel and just knit that whole thing and then add the sleeves and so forth later. Now, I love it when a culture makes a little bit of entertainment for us in the streets, something for free. When I got to Portugal, I was just thrilled. You know, here was black and white stones, nice, you know, natural stones laid in these wonderful geometric patterns. I think it'd be a little difficult to negotiate if you were on acid, but aside from that. Now, one of the worlds that really fed my knitting patterns was the world of carpets, of course, because there were wonderful geometric patterns and marvelous colors. And this was an old kilim I bought in Istanbul in the market, and came home and I knitted this sweater called the kilim jacket. And when that first came out in Rowan yarns, it was in the Rowan knitting book, it was modeled by Kate Moss, her last job for ordinary folk like us, before she went off and tripled her income. Now, I'm still interested in gray, and I come back to it quite often. I find it in my fabrics and in my knitting. It can be nice to revisit. And this was a linen range that Rowan was doing, and they had some beautiful pearly shades of gray, so I used those. This is just a recent one for Rowan. Now, I just put this in because I was in Canada, and I thought that this kind of wonderful carving on the side of a building was just too good to miss, and I thought that that halo was rather nice for my silver hair. Now, this is my studio. I'm sure that some magazine was just about to visit to photograph. It's never been that tidy, ever. But you can see all my china stacked up. These are, you know, my paintings got incredibly rich and colorful at the end. Just really, really into that. But I also, you know, design all these fabrics, and they come in the ranges. Brandon has a shelf here, and Philip Jacobs, who we're part of the Kaffe collective, and myself. And as the collections come in, they get stacked up, and when there's too many, they go upstairs to the archive. Now, I designed a design wall because every time I would give a workshop, I would say, please bring a neutral cloth, just a piece of flannel. Little pieces of fabric will stick to it. We can arrange a whole quilt and be able to stand back and look at it like a tapestry. But people would always bring something white or cream. I don't know what neutral means to people, but it doesn't mean what I think it should mean, which is taupe. So I put a taupe gray wall out onto the market, and it's become incredibly popular. Here's a quilt that I'm arranging on that work wall. You can see I can just do the entire thing, and then we photograph it, and it gets sewn together in that way. And you can see I'm into camouflage. Now, cultures that don't have where everybody hasn't been to the same art school is very exciting to me. This is the Aboriginal painters from Australia, and they work, I mean, I'm sure they worked always in clay and natural things like that to start with. Now they work in paint, but they still have the same kind of palette of very neutral colors and a whole language of dots and geometry that just fascinates me. It completely, I was so struck by it that when I first saw them, I collected every fabric I could find that was spotty and dotty and did a quilt when I got back to England. And this is the quilt. It was just a homage to Aboriginal dot language. And so you can see some of this is like snake skin or little daisies or rosebuds or whatever, but it was just anything that was a dotty kind of texture. Now, good ideas around every corner. People say to me, oh, there's no color in my part of the world, and I just, I want to roll up my sleeves and go up there and show them where the color is. This is just a grid in the street covering a sewer, probably, with wonderful old worn out pieces of glass in it. And look at the subtle colors in that thing. It's beautiful. Brandon took this kind of material and did a wonderful knit sweater called Old Tiles. And that was for Rowan. Now, we had an exhibition in Bath at the American Museum, and that was very exciting because it was designed by Johan Ingels from this part of the world, and he was the most wonderful, inspiring man to work with. And there was one crazy woman at one of the meetings we went to, and we said, we would like some volunteers to help us yarn bomb and things like that. And she stood up and said, I'll do it. And with her magenta dreadlocks, she went off and got an army of people, and they did the most elegant yarn bombing. So it was just thrilling. And there's some of the pieces that they made that were going to go onto the trees and all the kind of outside furniture around the exhibition. So the people were in the mood by the time they got there. One of the things we did was to buy little plastic buckets. This was Johan's idea, to look like lanterns. And we covered them with our fabrics and then varnished them and sent them up the tree right in front of the exhibition. Wow. Isn't that just marvelous? And all underneath, you can see those little balls hanging down. Those are all pom-poms. So it was just delightful. By the time people arrived, they were just in the party mood, I can tell you. Now, this is supposed to be my studio. I think it's the Hollywood version, a la Johan Ingels. His brilliant idea was to photograph one of my quilts and print that onto linoleum. So the floors all over became these incredible creations that were just exciting. And you can see lots of other things. Like here, this is a wonderful big carpet that I've done in needlepoint of vegetables. This was, the whole exhibition was broken up into colors, and this was the green room. And so everything in it was like to do with vegetables and leaves and flowers. But we photographed that and reproduced that as a linoleum. Look at that. People were bending down and touching it because they couldn't believe it wasn't needlepoint. It just was so, you could see every stitch. And the tapestry at the back was done for the not the Royal Shakespeare Company, but the A. Shakespeare Theatre in England. Now, we're always looking for colorful, interesting places and varied places, varied color, when we're going to photograph one of our quilt books, because we have a lot of different moods in quilts, and we like to come to a place like this and shove them out windows or, across a boat or down a walkway or something. So this is Cinque Terre in Italy, with these 5 wonderful villages in a row with gorgeous colors and very raw, marvelous color. So we'll be able to take a lot of different quality quilts and have pastel ones and bright ones and so forth, probably over that concrete wall and places like that. I was so taken by that place that when I came home, I was doing an exhibition up in Aberdeen. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Aberdeen in Scotland, but it is the grayest city in the world. It's actually stunningly gray. It's granite, and the architecture is very severe and exciting. But it is cold. And when you come off the streets into our exhibition, which we painted in Cinque Terre colors, and all this warm Italian light, people just, they just took off their coats and bathed in the warmth of it all. It was really nice. And they gave us the whole run of the museum to do a really exciting exhibition of all my work. This is just kind of, we get so many ideas when we're on the road, and this was Jordan we went to last year, and that's Brandon standing there in the striped shirt, next to this camel that is just covered with the most wonderful patterns. I mean, this could be carpets, it could be patchworks, it could be knitting, it could be anything. It's just a very, very exciting thing. That was at Petra in Jordan. Now, we were given 2 concrete rabbits or hares to decorate for charity, and then they were auctioned off later in Chichester in England. And so I covered mine with flowers, as I do, and put a little tie and so forth on mine. And Brandon was much more stylish with his. Rather African, really, I think. Now, we both love spots. And this is a shirt that I had made in Japan. And I just love these kind of big primitive spots. And then I got this scarf from China that is tie-dyed, and it just kind of worked well together. And Brandon, going on with spots for the patchwork world, it's very nice to create, we're creating a paint box for patchwork people, and it's very exciting to give them very nice primitive kind of geometry, a soft geometry. This is just rolled up paper. Somebody had done this wonderful design of a fish, and it's the kind of thing we take off the internet, that just is exciting possibilities, and could be a textile or a needlepoint or whatever. There's a needlepoint that Brandon did of fish. He did a fabric first that was incredibly popular called Gone Fishing, and then this was his version of it in needlepoint for the Ermine catalog. And he's followed that up with one called Shoal, which is out this season. And a lot of people are using that already in interesting ways. Like this girl just did a quilt with just a panel of Shoal surrounded by Philip Jacobs' nice curly snail shells. And there are some snail shells of mine done as a needlepoint idea. You can notice that I really am into camouflage and very, very close toned colors. But occasionally it's nice to put on some black and white shoes and do a tap dance, So there I'm being a little more contrasty. They're very, very lovely to do, just little strips of pattern that are beautifully woven in France. They do an exquisite job. I love stripes, and this is a wonderful old quilt. One of the most exciting exhibitions I've ever had, an exciting book as resulting from it, is the book that's going to come out at the end of this year, and it's called Ancestral Gifts, and it's to do with looking at a wonderful collection of antique quilts in the Quilt Museum in York, and picking 15 of the best, and then doing my version of them. As I say, stripes are very, very exciting. This is Brandon coming up against a wonderful mural in Canada where these 2 bollards just add to the fun of stripes on stripes. And I think this designer loved stripes and didn't stop at the furniture and the dress, just went right on. And some wonderful classic stripes in the Victorian Albert Museum. I finally did a book on that place because I had an exhibition there, and it was so exciting to have the run of all the rich decorative art that is in that museum. This is just some of the old Venetian glass that just had these gorgeous stripes. And there's just some big, bold awning kind of stripes that I've done as a big throw. This is a knitted throw, so And that's all knitted in one piece.
Did you knit it by hand?
Sorry?
Did you knit it by hand?
Oh, yes. I do everything by hand. Remember, I'm a Luddite. This is some of the stripes that we get woven in India. Brandon and I took a wonderful trip out to the jungles of India, sent by Oxfam, the charity, and they had us design stripes that could be done, just done by these wonderful, wonderful weavers. And they haven't lost the touch, even though they now have houses. They used to have, dirt floors and stick walls and things. Now they've got proper houses and they really can work full time. And so they're doing beautiful ranges for us. And there's Liza Lucy taking all of the stripes that are a very cool kind of coloring in our range and making a quilt, and photographed in Morocco. We're so excited when we can find a wonderful location that everything is, carefully handmade. I mean, like this beautiful door with carving and painting and, all that attention to detail is so much what we're about. And so it's wonderful when we can bring our two worlds together. So that's the last book, called Quilts in Morocco. This is Quilts in Provence, which was we found this wonderful little town called Roussillon in the south of France, where every wall was a kind of coloring that came out of the earth, and they had ochres and rusts and pinks and things. Anyway, this quilt was a quilt that I made after something I bought on eBay. And I love the idea that you just took one block, which was diagonal stripes, and made an amazing kind of tapestry of pattern. It could come out like X's, so I called it X Factor. And I was so struck by that I did it also as a knitting pattern for Peruvian Connection, which is a catalog that I designed for in America. They're knitted in Peru, but what I do is I just knitted up a big sheet of patterns as if it was patchwork, but it's all knitted in one piece, and in wonderful alpaca yarns. And then I had a challenge, and this time, because people say to me, oh, I can't do Fair Isle, I can't do color work, I said, I'll do something that won't scare the horses. We're going to just cast on 2 stitches, and then you increase, and you're knitting stripes, and any idiot can knit stripes. So we did that challenge, and it was brilliant. People took it up all over the world, and the first thing we did was run out of red, because everybody was picking the red colorway. But I loved the blue colorway, and then we did a very toasty brown colorway. And of course, you always have to do something for the beige ladies. So we had the beige ones that's going to definitely not scare the horses. And
Hey, can you explain that it's stripes or squares?
yeah, you're just starting out with 2 stitches at each corner, and you're just knitting stripes, and then you start decreasing out that corner. Easy peasy. Anybody can do it. Now this is taking the stripes that we've already had woven and cutting them into triangles and creating these kind of box structures for a little book that I did called Brilliant Knits. So it's small projects. Yeah, sorry, Brilliant Little Patchworks. There it is. You can read it for yourself. And that's fun. Just, small projects that you can do, like table runners and throws for couches and cushions and things. There's a cushion with Brandon's fabric on the outside called Labels, and the big gazania by Philip Jacobs in the middle. And there's just a nice simple blue and white. This is the very first design that I ever did. It's still in the range, which is a miracle. 15 years later. It's called Roman Glass, and that was done from a little fragment in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, I love blue and white, and a French friend of mine loves it too, and she was This is the patchwork quilt that I did with all of my stripes, the kind of warmer ones, creating diamonds and sewing those together to create this zigzag, which I call Rosita, after Rosita Missoni, the wonderful family of knitters, probably the most fabulous knitting in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I just love them, of machine knitting. And so it's a whole area of zigzags. You can see zigzags in knitting and so forth and so on.
The quilt is in shots and stripes.
Yeah, that quilt, if you want the recipe for it, is in a book called Shots and Stripes, which is, I was going to call Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Because it's only my shot cottons and my striped fabrics. There's another zigzag that I've just brought out as a knitting pattern for Rowan. And this one, which I think is here somewhere. Yes, yeah. And that's taking two ends of yarn so that you can run two colors together and make these wonderful kind of mixtures, which makes making a kind of tapestry of patches like that very easy to do.
The sample's on the bookshelf here.
Oh, right. Yeah, the sample's on the bookshelf. I knew it was around here somewhere. Okay, this is the kind of thing I look for when we're traveling the world. You know, we're going over the mountains of Tennessee, and this barn with these old license plates, it was just perfect. It just made me think of quilts. And there's a quilt that it could be from. You know, this is a very scrappy quilt that a friend of mine collects called Roderick Kirikoff, and he's done this book with Stewart Tabori and Chang publishers in New York, and it's just wonderful. If you like really off-the-wall scrappy quilts, that's what he collects, and I just absolutely love every one of them. They give me so many ideas. When we went to Morocco, it was exciting. You know, what we do is we take a big suitcase full of quilts and we just trail around and looking for something that kind of goes together. Well, this rack of shoes was perfect for this quilt, don't you think? So that was a good match. And this wonderful kitsch room in a hotel in Fez became a great setting for this red quilt. What I loved was the tiles, the wonderful kind of gauloise blue on the walls, and then this kind of hideous, you know, furniture of cut velvet. Wonderful how brilliant that all is together, and it's perfect setting for our quilt. This is another thing that just thrills me when I come across some kind of graffiti or some strange thing on a street that is full of ideas. I mean, this is just racing with ideas for bright, you know, contrasting color to be in quilts. I've done a quilt on it, but I haven't got it here today to show you, but exciting. But this is a quilt that I had done earlier, you know, with stripes, just blocks of stripes put together. And this man wandered into the exhibition, and we said, "Excuse me, could you just stop a minute?" While we took his photograph. It turned out he knitted that sweater himself. This was in Germany. Yeah, I was well impressed. I was clapping. This was a design that I had done, and he found it somewhere and made himself a sweater with that design. And there's a similar design, this time done in shot cottons. This is for the Shots and Stripes book. Kind of, you know, these kind of oriental S's, which became this nice design. Now, it always interests us that when people are working in our workshops, they usually are totally unaware that they're creating exactly what they're wearing. And it's so amazing to us that they can't see it, they can't be aware of it. But anyways, when we tapped her on the shoulder, she was quite surprised. Even purple hair. I mean, we could have done the whole talk on these pictures. I'm telling you, it's just wonderful. This is a design I did called Antwerp, and it's looking at a little piece of furnishing fabric I saw in a window in Belgium. And, you know, it just it just was a nice little idea, these little kind of primitive flowers. So I did it as a needlepoint as well as a furnishing, as a patchwork fabric. It's lovely to stitch. It's really nice.
Do you do your own stitching?
Oh yes, I do. I stitch always the first design and send it in, and then it's printed from that. Now, here's a bit of process. I hate giving process away because it's like you might break the spell, or it's also just kind of weird to me, that people want to know how things are done, but I know that people do, so I've gotten used to it. Now, so I draw a design out in pencil, and this was I wanted to do a paisley, a very rich paisley, so I got out all of my reference books on paisleys, and I have lots of reference books. So I was looking at stripes, at flowers, at big leaves done in paisley kind of language, and started to put this design together. And then I started filling in the colors, and each color I fill in gets a little pad down here so that when I do the next colorway, each of these is going to equal another color in the next colorway, which creates another color mood. And that's a half drop repeat. Thank you for that. That was lovely. I like those little ahs. So that was the first colorway, and there's it on a chair, so you can see how it cuts up. And there's the red colorway. As I say, I love things that are on the street. This is just, I think this was Holland with this little row of Dutch houses painted on the street. And I love the way they park their bicycles against it, And it becomes a design of windows, doesn't it? And here's another design of windows. This is an idea that I did this knitted sweater from an old rag rug in the American Museum. And I just loved these kind of warehouses with doors and windows, So that was fun to do. And Brandon was intrigued by doors and windows in a very primitive little painting from Brazil, and did this fabric from it called Shantytown. It's been very popular. Don't you love her boots? And he did it as a needlepoint too. Again, fun to stitch. Now this was one of the most exciting artworks of this century, I think. This was little porcelain poppies that were made by this artist on a long wire, and day by day by day they kept planting more and more of these in this great big memorial to every fallen soldier in the First World War. So it was an incredible memorial. It was like, these are the towers of London, so the bloody towers with this, like blood pouring down onto the floor. It was the most moving thing. And what you can't see is thousands of people, every day more and more people coming to watch this thing grow. And it was just, you could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet, and people were just so moved by it. Now, as I say, I love old quilts, and we're starting a little section here to do with circles. And I love the way the old quilts played with different geometry. And this one is called Wheels, and it's just wonderful, scrappy wheels. This is a wonderful piece from the York Quilt Museum collection. And there's my version of it on the wall there. And that's the way it'll appear in the book. A little more styled. And speaking of circles, this is a painting I just did in Big Sur when I get together with my sister. She loves to paint, and her daughter does too. And the three of us just sit and paint and paint and paint, and we paint a lot of still lives because if the weather's not so good, we just stay indoors and get on with it. But that was just playing with circles. And more circles. There's just, wonderful decorative bowls in a market. The kind of thing that catches our eye as we're traveling around the world. And these are hats that I make. People ask me if I crochet. Well, I can only crochet around in a circle. So I just start in the center and I go round and round and round and make a hat. And then I cover them with buttons and beads, as you do, you know. So it's circles on circles. And some natural circles. Aren't they lovely? And some fabulous circles from Japan. You know, one of the great things about traveling the world, you get to see all these different cultures dealing with the thing of sewing and making something decorative and beautiful. And that just wonderful little buttons of fabric sewn to this quilt. But that's just the beginning. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? Now, this is a Chinese artist who enjoys painting himself into the scene that he's going to enter. So he's lying here painted with rocks because he rather likes this pebble beach. You can see his nostrils up there and his eyes above the nostrils. I'm not going to point out the rest, but you can work it out. But can you imagine when his wife says, "What did you do today, darling?" I was lying on the beach all day. Now, this is more circles. Aren't these fabulous? That's pieces of rubber made into a couch. How thrilling is that? Wonderful use of color. And that's one of my paintings, sort of half finished. Just looking at open bowls and cups. This.
Pictures improved greatly from your wife's days.
Oh, yes, thank you. She says I've improved since my white days.
Perspective, you know.
Yeah. Oh, good. I came here for some expert advice. Now, this is Suzani. Yesterday we had the great thrill of going to a fabulous collection of Suzanis that somebody's selling from her house. But it's a culture that I love. I love when people have a language of circles and paisleys and they just play with it over and over and over, variation after variation, so you can really concentrate on color themes and so forth. So I'm doing a very, very dark, husky kind of colorway on Suzani. Now, Suzani is usually a white background with little red circles, but it was fun to play with colors. And here is taking every circular fabric in my collection and doing a quilt called Snowball, which is, I mean, actually it's called chintz, but it is snowballs to create the border, which is a kind of circular pattern. And into those circles I put more circles. And then the center, you can see, is a design that is taken from a carpet that is lots of kind of circular motifs. And it's called sprays. That's an old fabric of mine. And we liked this so much that we did workshops all over the world based on that quilt. And this is the wonderful, totally different mood that was created by one of the, in New Zealand, these wonderful farmers' wives came in and kicked off their shoes and went to work. And they created the most exciting quilts. Look at this absolute cream puff of a quilt. I mean, to me, we were just in Austria looking at the churches, and this is the color scheme of the murals in those wonderful Austrian churches. And there's just gorgeous greens. I mean, this is like the most beautiful greenhouse, isn't it? So that you can see that they just get started with an idea like this, and we help them sort it out to make it really juicy, and then they go home and sew it when we're not in the building. Now, this is one of my fabrics that is just called Thousand Flowers, and you can see the way I'm starting to paint, drawing out an outline of the design, and then filling in the colors and putting in a little tab of color for each one that goes in. And there's the different colorways that resulted from that fabric. Sorry? I don't even know how to start a computer. I wouldn't know what button to push. So yes, I paint by hand. Each colorway. It's not so difficult, you know. You can do it. Sorry?
Are you working in gouache?
In gouache, absolutely, yes. Because it's nice opaque, you know where you've been. So this is taking that idea into knitting. So here's the same sort of layout of layers of chrysanthemums done as a knit for Rowan. And here's another Oriental idea. I got a lot of ideas from the Orient. This is from Japan, a wonderful kind of tapestry-like piece of fabric that I saw, and I thought, that's a nice idea, these big flowers floating on this surface. So I call it Dream. And there's the different moods that are created from that. Nice hot reds and soft greens and kind of murky browns and blues, etc. Now, this is back in Morocco. We found this wonderful little French cafe, and we liked it a lot. Sorry for coughing into the microphone. This is a little teapot or tea kettle design that was done by Pauline Smith, and look how beautifully it worked with their red tablecloths and blue chairs in the place. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show you a quilt that we did for this same book, Quilts in Morocco, and we did it with very kind of all the star shapes in between here were done in solid fabrics, and I'm going to show you the difference. I got an idea when I was doing one of the workshops to do it in patterns, because I noticed that some people were playing with patterns on those points. And so the Mediterranean hexagons became fabulous when you put patterns into these points. Oh, it's gone now. So anyway, here we are with another version of it. This was a wonderful version. This is flying pigs. This is tomatoes, basketballs, peaches, Brandon's design called fish lips, and even Kardashian underwear down there. You know, just fabulous. Anything goes, and it's exciting. It just was one of the most thrilling workshops. This is where you get your car fixed in Morocco. When's the last time you pulled up to a garage that looked like that? Boy, that was so exciting. I couldn't believe it. Back to the scrappy quilts from the Quilt Museum. This is my version of one called Donuts. And that was fun, just taking the colors from the sort of dusty old ones into something a little brighter. And another one, this was, the original version of this was done in 1930s fabrics, and that was fun to do it in my kind of classics. And you can see underneath there is a pair of boots. Brandon wanted to go to Glastonbury, which is a big, you know that place. Lots of noise and mud. And so you have to wear boots. And Brandon was going to wear black boots, and I said, oh, we got to do something about that. So I painted tumbling blocks on his boots. Here's another one of the antiques, and this is an exquisite piece. All these beautiful little applique animals and flowers and so forth and so on. And it's called the Red Courthouse. So I grabbed red, color, and so I did my version of it in red fabrics. See, what I loved about it was that you got small, medium, and large squares, just rows of squares. Very, very simple, but just beautiful and very achievable by a quilt maker. So it was really fun doing that project. Now, we're ending here with, I've gone into the scent world for the first time. We're doing a range of products that have a nice scent to them. And to do it, I did a collage of flowers on one of my paperweight fabrics, and then we used that as the packaging for the whole range. So this is a little embossed tin box. Thank you for that. A little tin box that's got embossed flowers on it, and you can see all different ways of using that collage that became quite charming. And they're doing also a beautiful little bag with it printed on. And it's kfassettfragrance.com, I'm told. That's that other language I don't understand, the .com world. But anyway, thank you very much. That's been nice talking to you. Thank you.